September 10, 1944. Brussels, Belgium. The tarmac of the Ever airfield is still scarred from recent fighting, the concrete pockmarked and swept by a cold wind that hints at the autumn fast approaching. When the C-47 transport plane touches down, taxiing to a halt under the gray, low-hanging sky, the man who steps out is the most powerful military officer in the Western world. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, has not come to this liberated capital for a parade. He has come to manage a crisis that threatens to tear the Allied command structure apart from the inside. Waiting for him is Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, the victor of El Alamein and the commander of the 21st Army Group. The dynamic between the two men is already frayed. Montgomery, sharp-featured and wearing his trademark beret, regards the American general not just as a superior, but as a manager of resources who lacks the tactical brilliance to finish the war. The tension on the tarmac is palpable, thicker than the fog rolling off the North Sea. Montgomery does not invite Eisenhower to a headquarters building. Instead, they meet in the cramped, cold fuselage of the field marshal's personal transport plane to ensure privacy. The map of Europe has changed violently in the last 6 weeks. To the casual observer, the Third Reich is collapsing. Since the breakout from Normandy in August, the Allied armies have surged forward at a pace that has stunned even their own commanders. They have liberated Paris, swept through Belgium, and are now pressing against the borders of Germany itself. In just 19 days, between August 25 and September 12, the Allied advance has consumed maps that planners expected would take 260 days to traverse. The Wehrmacht appears broken, fleeing in disarray, leaving behind burning vehicles and shattered units. But inside that aircraft cabin in Brussels, the mood is not one of celebration. It is a cage match over the future of the war. Montgomery is aggressive. He waves a sheaf of telegrams, his voice rising, lecturing the supreme commander. He argues that the current strategy is a recipe for disaster. His proposal is radical, dangerous, and, in his eyes, the only way to end the killing by Christmas 1944. He calls for a single thrust. Montgomery wants Eisenhower to halt the American armies in the South, specifically General George S. Patton's Third Army, and divert every gallon of fuel, every truck, and every round of ammunition to the north. He proposes a massive, concentrated spearhead of 40 divisions, a force of hundreds of thousands of men, to strike a singular, pencil-thin blow across the Rhine, straight through the heart of the Ruhr industrial region, and on to Berlin. He is asking for a monopoly on the Allied war effort. He wants the 12th Army Group to stop in its tracks so the 21st Army Group can win the war. Eisenhower listens, his face set in a mask of practiced patience. He knows the reality that the maps don't show. The Great Swan across France has been a logistical miracle, but it is now becoming a logistical nightmare. The laws of physics are catching up with the liberators. The Allied supply lines are stretched to the breaking point. Every jerry can of gasoline, every tin of rations, and every artillery shell is still being brought in over the beaches of Normandy or through the ruined port of Cherbourg, some 400 miles behind the front lines. To keep the tanks moving, the Allies have instituted the Red Ball Express, a frantic, round-the-clock convoy system where nearly 6,000 trucks race down a one-way loop of French highways, burning nearly as much fuel as they deliver. Drivers are falling asleep at the wheel, vehicles are breaking down by the roadside, and the tires are literally melting off the rims. The British logistics are in no better shape. Just days prior, a discovery rocked the Royal Army Service Corps. 1,400 of their vital 3-ton trucks were found to have defective pistons, rendering them useless just as the pursuit of the Germans reached its climax. The Allied war machine is a gas-guzzling beast, and it is starving. Eisenhower knows that Montgomery's plan for a single thrust relies on a logistical foundation that simply does not exist. SHAEF planners have already crunched the numbers. They doubt the capability of the supply chain to support a 40-division force deep inside enemy territory, separated from its depots by hundreds of miles of hostile ground. If that single thrust is cut off, if the Germans pinch the flanks, the flower of the British Army could be encircled and annihilated. Furthermore, there is the political dimension, the silent partner in every decision Eisenhower makes. The American public, and the massive American army now deployed on the continent, will not tolerate sitting idle while the British claim the glory of the final victory. A broad front strategy, advancing all armies simultaneously to the Rhine, ensures that the pressure is kept on the Germans everywhere, preventing them from shifting reserves to block a single avenue of approach. It keeps Patton moving, it keeps Bradley moving, and it keeps the alliance healthy. But Montgomery is relentless. He argues that splitting the resources means neither the northern nor the southern thrust is full-blooded. He warns that a broad front strategy will allow the Germans to recover, to dig in, and to drag the war into 1945. He demands priority. In the background of this debate, sits the immense, silent prize of Antwerp. Captured nearly intact by the British 11th Armored Division on September 4, the city's port facilities are a logistician's dream. 592 cranes standing idle, miles of deepwater quays, and a peacetime capacity to discharge between 80,000 and 100,000 tons of cargo daily. It is the solution to the supply crisis. But there is a catch, one that Montgomery has largely ignored in his race for the Rhine. The port is 60 miles inland, and the 80-kilometer approach through the Scheldt estuary is heavily mined and flanked by German coastal batteries. Until those guns are silenced and the waters swept, Antwerp is nothing more than a tantalizing mirage. Eisenhower knows that opening this port is the sine qua non, the absolute necessity for the final conquest of Germany. Yet in the freezing cabin of his C-47, he faces a commander who is looking past the logistics to a shimmering strategic mirage of his own. Eisenhower strikes a compromise, a decision that will have bloody ramifications for thousands of paratroopers. He firmly rejects the full, single thrust. He tells Montgomery that the mathematics simply do not work. A 40-division drive with exposed flanks is a gamble the Allies cannot afford when victory seems inevitable through methodical pressure. However, he does not leave the field marshal empty-handed. Recognizing the need to seize bridgeheads across the Rhine before the German defense solidifies, and perhaps needing to placate the British public's desire for a leading role, Eisenhower sanctions a limited version of Montgomery's concept. He authorizes a daring airborne operation to pave the way for a thrust into the Netherlands. It is not the march on Berlin, but it is a chance to turn the German northern flank. 7 days later, on September 17, the sky over the Netherlands turns dark with aircraft. Operation Market Garden begins. It is the largest airborne operation in history, a vertical envelopment designed to bypass the Siegfried Line and place the Allies across the Rhine at Arnhem. Over 34,600 troops from the 1st Allied Airborne Army drop from the clouds, tasked with seizing a series of bridges along a 62-mile corridor. This is the single-thrust philosophy in microcosm, a narrow, deep penetration into enemy territory, relying on speed and shock to overcome the lack of secure flanks. For a brief moment, it looks as though Montgomery's gamble might pay off. In the south, the U.S. 101st Airborne seizes key crossings, and the British XXX Corps begins its armored drive up the single, elevated road that the troops soon christen Hell's Highway. But the friction of war, which Eisenhower's broad front strategy seeks to mitigate through redundancy, immediately begins to grind the operation down. The intelligence was flawed. The Germans are not a broken rabble but are refitting SS Panzer divisions in the exact area where the British 1st Airborne Division lands. The battle rages for 9 days. At Arnhem, the bridge too far, the British paratroopers are cut off, surrounded and pounded by heavy armor. The narrow corridor meant to supply them is repeatedly cut by German counterattacks, proving Eisenhower's fears about the vulnerability of a single thrust. By September 25, the dream collapses. The remnants of the British 1st Airborne are withdrawn across the river under cover of darkness. The cost of this experiment is staggering. The division leaves behind nearly 8,000 men killed, missing, or captured. Total Allied casualties for Market Garden climbed to 17,000. The 62-mile salient is established, but the prize, the crossing into Germany, remains out of reach. The failure reinforces Eisenhower's conviction. There are no shortcuts. The Wehrmacht still has teeth, and a narrow thrust is a recipe for encirclement. While the tragedy at Arnhem plays out, the supply situation reaches a critical breaking point. The Red Ball Express is faltering, vehicles are worn out, and the autumn rains are turning the road networks into quagmires. The failure to prioritize the clearing of the Scheldt estuary immediately after the capture of Antwerp now comes back to haunt the Allied command. On October 15, Eisenhower, his patience exhausted, issues a direct and biting order to Montgomery. He effectively strips the field marshal of his discretion, ordering him to cease all offensive operations toward the Rhine and prioritize every available resource to clearing the Scheldt. The resulting campaign is some of the most miserable fighting of the war. The 1st Canadian Army is tasked with rooting out dug-in German defenders from a flooded, freezing landscape of dikes and polders. It is amphibious warfare in the mud. For weeks, Canadian and British troops slog through waist-deep water, battling for every yard of the estuary banks. It takes until November 8 to silence the guns, and another 3 weeks for the minesweepers to clear the channel. Finally, on November 28, 1944, 85 days after the city was captured, the Canadian-built freighter SS Fort Cataraqui steams up the Scheldt and docks in Antwerp. The logistical strangulation is over, but the delay has bought the Third Reich 3 months of life. With the supply lines finally shortening, Eisenhower resumes the broad front advance, but the momentum of the summer is gone. The Allies are now facing the German border in the dead of winter. The strategy requires a massive frontage to be manned, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. This dispersion of force means that, while the Allies are strong everywhere, they are not overwhelmingly concentrated anywhere. To maintain the offensive in the north and south, Eisenhower is forced to take a calculated risk in the center. The Ardennes Forest, a region of dense woods and rolling hills in Belgium and Luxembourg, is designated a quiet sector. It is used as a resting ground for battered American divisions recovering from the Huerchen Forest and a training ground for green units fresh from the States. The terrain is considered too difficult for major armored operations, a lesson the Allies believe the Germans learned in 1940 and would not dare repeat in winter. Consequently, the line here is dangerously thin. By mid-December, the broad front strategy has placed Allied armies at the precipice of the German homeland, but the advance is a slow, grinding attrition. Eisenhower believes the Germans are incapable of staging a major offensive. His intelligence chief at SHAEF assures him that the enemy lacks the fuel and reserves for anything more than local counterattacks. They are wrong. Unknown to SHAEF, Adolf Hitler has stripped the eastern front of armor and scraped together the last reserves of the Reich for one final, desperate gamble. His goal is to exploit the very weakness Montgomery had warned about, the overstretched line, but with a twist. Hitler aims to punch through the thin American center in the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and recapture the port of Antwerp. If successful, he would split the British and American armies, depriving the Allies of their primary supply hub and potentially forcing a negotiated peace. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes is shattered by the roar of over 1,000 German artillery pieces. The Ghost Front erupts. 3 German armies, comprising over 200,000 men and hundreds of tanks, smash into the unsuspecting American lines. The weather works in Hitler's favor. Heavy fog and snow ground the superior Allied air force, blinding Eisenhower's eyes in the sky. Confusion reigns. In the first hours of the assault, the command posts are blind. Telephone lines are cut by infiltrators wearing captured American uniforms, and radio traffic is jammed by German interference. The sheer scale of the offensive is initially lost in the fog of war. Reports filtering back to SHAEF speak only of local skirmishes, not a tidal wave of 3 German armies. But as the sun fails to break through the overcast sky on December 17, the reality becomes terrifyingly clear. The ghost front has materialized into a steel wedge aimed straight at the heart of the Allied coalition. The objective is not just territory, it is the very lifeline Eisenhower had fought so hard to secure. The panzers are rolling for Antwerp. If the Germans can reach the port, they will sever the supply lines feeding the British 21st Army Group and the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies. They will physically split the Allied force in two, creating a political and military crisis that could force a negotiated peace. For the critics of the Supreme Commander, the Ardennes offensive is the grim receipt for the broad front strategy. They argue that by spreading his forces thin from Switzerland to the North Sea, Eisenhower has invited this disaster, leaving the center weak to support attacks on the flanks. Montgomery's warnings about the dangers of dispersion now seem prophetic to his supporters in London. The single thrust might have left flanks exposed, but the broad front has left the center hollow. Yet in the drafty, high-ceiling tactical headquarters at Verdun on December 19, Dwight Eisenhower demonstrates why he holds the supreme command. While panic begins to ripple through the rear echelons, with rumors of German assassination squads hunting high-ranking officers, Eisenhower walks into the conference room with a calm that borders on unnatural. He looks at his subordinates, including a grim-faced Omar Bradley and an impatient George Patton. He does not see a disaster. He sees the mistake his enemy has finally made. By leaving their fortifications to fight in the open, the Germans have exposed their last reserves to the overwhelming firepower of the Allied armies. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster, he tells his generals. There will be only cheerful faces at this table. This is the vindication of the broad front, though in a way no one expected. A single deep thrust would have been brittle, easily snapped by a flank attack. But the broad, heavy line of the Allied advance, though thin in spots, has depth and massive lateral mobility. Eisenhower orders Patton to do the impossible, disengage the Third Army from its offensive in the Saar, turn 90 degrees to the north, and drive into the German flank. It is a logistical feat that rivals the invasion of Normandy itself. In less than 48 hours, Patton swings an entire army corps, thousands of vehicles and tens of thousands of men, onto icy, narrow roads, driving them straight into the blizzard to relieve the besieged crossroads town of Bastogne. It is a maneuver that Montgomery's static, set-piece philosophy would deem reckless, but one that American mobility makes possible. However, the crisis forces Eisenhower to make a concession that chafes at national pride. With the German wedge driving deep between the American 12th Army Group and the British 21st, communications between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and his northern armies are severed. Pragmatism overrides politics. Eisenhower temporarily transfers command of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, the northern shoulder of the Bulge, to Field Marshal Montgomery. Montgomery acts with characteristic caution and professional rigor. He tidies up the lines, shortening the front and gathering reserves, refusing to counterattack until the German momentum is fully spent. To the Americans fighting desperately at St. Vith and Elsenborn Ridge, Montgomery's deliberate pace is maddening. To the British, it is the steady hand saving the Americans from their own recklessness. The friction between the two strategic philosophies flares up again, even as their soldiers fight side by side. Montgomery views the battle as a chance to finally implement his single command concept, implying to the press that he has rescued the shattered American forces. It is a public relations disaster that nearly leads Eisenhower to sack him, requiring the intervention of intense diplomacy to smooth over. But the German gamble is doomed by the very logistics that dictated Eisenhower's strategy in September. The Wehrmacht's plan relies on capturing Allied fuel dumps to keep their Tiger and Panther tanks moving. They find the dumps burned or empty. The Red Ball Express logic works in reverse for the enemy. Their supply lines, stretching back through the snowy Eifel Mountains, are strangled. When the weather finally breaks on December 23, the sky clears to a brilliant, cold blue. The Allied air forces, grounded for weeks, descend with vengeance. Fighter bombers catch German columns bumper to bumper on the narrow Ardennes roads, turning the offensive into a highway of burning steel. By January 25, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge is officially over. The original front line is restored. The cost is exorbitant, over 80,000 American casualties, with at least 8,600 killed. It is the bloodiest battle in U.S. Army history. But the strategic ledger tells a different story. The Germans have suffered irreplaceable losses, over 100,000 men and virtually all their remaining armor in the West. Hitler has spent his last coin. The broad front, criticized for being a slow, grinding approach, has functioned exactly as a meat grinder should. It absorbed the enemy's best punch and destroyed his capacity to wage war. With the Ardennes salient eliminated, the debate over the single thrust is effectively dead, buried under the snows of Belgium. There is no longer any question of a narrow, lightning strike to Berlin. The war has become a battle of attrition, a methodical crushing of resistance that requires the full weight of every Allied army. The broad front is no longer just a strategy. It is the inevitable reality of a coalition war entering its final act. The advance resumes, not as a rapier thrust, but as a tide. To the north, Montgomery's 21st Army Group, now fully supplied through the bustling wharves of Antwerp, prepares to force the Rhine. In the center and south, the American armies grind forward, chewing through the Siegfried Line pillbox by pillbox. The dream of ending the war by Christmas 1944 has proven to be a phantom, dispelled by the hard reality of industrial warfare. The Allied victory in the Ardennes is not the lightning stroke Montgomery had envisioned, nor is it the clean, decisive maneuver of a map-room exercise. It is a victory of brute force, logistics, and the resilience of the American soldier. As the snows of January 1945 begin to turn to gray slush, revealing the debris of a shattered Wehrmacht, the strategic debate that began in a Brussels hotel room 4 months earlier is finally settled by the facts on the ground. The single thrust is dead because the enemy has proven too resilient for gambles. The broad front is now the only path because it is the only strategy that leverages the Allies' greatest advantage, overwhelming material superiority. Yet, the human cost of this realization is etched into the frozen landscape. The elimination of the Bulge restores the front line to where it stood in mid-December, but the ledger has changed irrevocably. The United States Army has suffered over 80,000 casualties in the Ardennes campaign alone. It is a staggering price for a quiet sector. However, in the cold calculus of Supreme Headquarters, the exchange rate favors the Allies. The Germans have lost 100,000 men, and more critically, the bulk of their remaining armor in the West. They have no more reserves to plug the gaps. The broad front, often criticized for lacking the killer instinct of a concentrated drive, has functioned as a massive, relentless press. It has forced the enemy to defend everywhere, stretched him until he snapped, and then crushed his last desperate counterpunch. But as the guns fall silent in the Ardennes and the armies pivot back toward the German border, the coalition command structure nearly tears itself apart one last time. The tension between the single thrust philosophy and the broad front reality manifests in a bitter personal feud. On January 7, 1945, while the battle still rages, Field Marshal Montgomery holds a press conference that becomes legendary for all the wrong reasons. In front of the world's press, he describes the Battle of the Bulge as an interesting little tournament, implying that he had personally rescued the faltering American armies. He praises the American soldier, but characterizes the command decisions in a way that suggests the British 21st Army Group had to step in to salvage a disaster created by American incompetence. The reaction at 12th Army Group headquarters is volcanic. General Omar Bradley, usually a man of mild temperament, threatens to resign rather than serve under Montgomery again. General Patton is apoplectic. The alliance, having just survived its greatest military test on the continent, faces a political implosion. Eisenhower, exhausted and under immense pressure, finally reaches his limit. The supreme commander, who has spent months balancing the egos of his subordinates to maintain the broad front strategy, prepares a cable to Washington and London. He is ready to issue an ultimatum. It is him or me. He can no longer tolerate the friction that Montgomery's insistence on a single command and the implied superiority of his narrow front doctrine brings to the coalition. It takes the intervention of Eisenhower's chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, to talk Montgomery down. The field marshal is forced to send a letter of apology, a rare humiliation for the victor of El Alamein. The crisis passes, but the scar remains. It reinforces Eisenhower's conviction that the final drive into Germany must be a shared burden, a broad advance where American and British armies march shoulder to shoulder, sharing both the glory and the butcher's bill. With the command crisis suppressed and the lines restored, the Allied machine begins to roll forward again in February 1945. This time, there is no talk of a 40-division sprint to Berlin. The strategy is methodical, grinding, and terrifyingly powerful. The broad front has matured into a relentless tide of steel. The key to this renewed offensive is no longer a mystery. It is the port of Antwerp. The decision Eisenhower made in October to prioritize the Scheldt estuary, a decision that delayed the advance and frustrated his commanders, now pays its dividends. Despite the Germans launching thousands of V-1 and V-2 rockets at the city, a campaign of terror that turns the City of Diamonds into a target zone, the port remains open. 13,000 Belgian dockworkers, braving the rocket attacks, work around the clock. The daily discharge capacity climbs toward 100,000 tons. The famine of the autumn is over. There are no more Red Ball Express, trucks burning out their engines on 400-mile supply runs from Normandy. The depots behind the front lines are bursting with fuel, ammunition, and winter gear. This logistical dominance allows Eisenhower to unleash the full weight of his armies simultaneously, denying the Germans the ability to shift their dwindling reserves. In the north, the 1st Canadian Army and the British 2nd Army launch Operation Veritable. Their objective is to clear the ground between the Maas and the Rhine. It is a nightmare of terrain. The Reichswald forest is a dense, waterlogged tangle of trees and mud, heavily fortified by the Siegfried Line. The British and Canadians fight through appalling conditions, sometimes advancing in amphibious vehicles over flooded fields, grinding forward yard by yard. Simultaneously in the center, the U.S. Ninth Army prepares to launch Operation Grenade, the southern pincer designed to meet the British and trap the German forces west of the Rhine. But here, the friction of war intervenes again. The Germans, realizing the trap, sabotage the discharge valves of the Roer River dams. A torrent of water sweeps down the valley, widening the river and turning the crossing sites into impassable lakes. The Americans are forced to wait for 2 agonizing weeks for the waters to recede. During this pause, Eisenhower visits the forward headquarters of the Ninth Army. The mood is different now than it was in September. There is no euphoric talk of the war ending in weeks. The commanders, staring at the floodwaters and the concrete teeth of the Siegfried Line beyond, know that the broad front means a series of brutal, yard-by-yard struggle through the mud of the Rhineland, a campaign of attrition where the prize is not a city, but the destruction of the German armies west of the river. When the floodwaters of the Roer finally recede on February 23, 1945, the Ninth Army unleashes Operation Grenade. It is the southern jaw of the trap. To the north, the Canadians and British have been drawing the German reserves into the Reichswald forest, fighting a grinding battle that resembles the worst days of the First World War. This is the broad front in action. The northern pressure forces the enemy to commit his last coherent units to the British sector, leaving the south exposed. When the Americans surge across the Roer, the German front collapses. The pincer snaps shut. By early March, the Allied armies are standing on the west bank of the Rhine, looking across the dark, swirling waters at the heartland of the Reich. Behind them, the wreckage of the German 15th and 1st Parachute Armies lies scattered across the plains. The Wehrmacht has lost another 300,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured, in the defense of the Rhineland. The Rhine River is the last great psychological and physical barrier protecting Germany. It is a mythical boundary in the German consciousness, and Hitler has issued orders that every bridge must be blown the moment Allied troops approach. The broad front strategy has brought Eisenhower's armies to the river's edge along a massive frontage, from the Netherlands in the north to Switzerland in the south. The enemy is stretched to the breaking point, unable to guess where the blow will fall. Montgomery, true to form, is preparing a colossal set-piece crossing in the north, Operation Plunder, complete with airborne drops and a massive artillery barrage, scheduled for late March. He is gathering supplies, boats, and men, refusing to move until every detail is perfect. But the American armies, operating with the aggressive latitude Eisenhower's strategy permits, are not waiting for a scheduled appointment. They are probing, looking for a crack in the wall. On the afternoon of March 7, 1945, a task force of the U.S. 9th Armored Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engemann, reaches the heights overlooking the town of Remagen. Through the misty rain, they see something impossible. The Ludendorff Bridge, a massive railway span of black iron and stone towers, is still standing. Traffic is retreating across it to the east bank. The demolition charges have not been fired. In the lead half-track, Second Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, a young officer born in Frankfurt just 22 years earlier, stares at the bridge. He knows the standing orders, sees bridges intact if possible. But he also knows it is likely a trap, rigged to blow the moment his men set foot on the decking. The order comes down from Brigadier General William Hoge. Go for it. Timmermann leads his platoon of infantry onto the bridge, dodging machine gun fire from the towers. As they run, a deafening roar shakes the structure. The Germans have fired the emergency demolition charge. A cloud of smoke and dust engulfs the span. The Americans hit the deck, expecting to feel the bridge crumble beneath them and drop into the freezing Rhine. But as the smoke clears, the bridge remains. The charge was too weak. It has lifted the bridge off its bearings but failed to sever the main arch. The structure settles back down with a groan of tortured steel. "Get across," Timmermann screams. His men sprint through the smoke, cutting wires and throwing charges into the river. Sergeant Alexander Drabick is the first American soldier to cross the Rhine, running the gauntlet of sniper fire to reach the east bank. Within minutes, the Americans have a foothold in the heart of Germany. When the news reaches SHAEF, the reaction is electric. Eisenhower is on the phone with Omar Bradley. "Hot damn," the Supreme Commander shouts. "Brad, that's wonderful. Sure, get right on across with everything you've got. It's the best break we've had." This is the vindication of the broad front's flexibility. Had Eisenhower committed to a single, narrow thrust in the north under Montgomery, the 9th Armored would never have been at Remagen. The bridge would have been blown at leisure by a German rear guard facing no pressure. Instead, the constant, lateral pressure of the Allied advance forced the Germans to make mistakes, and the decentralized command structure allowed a junior officer like Timmermann to exploit a fleeting opportunity that a more rigid plan would have missed. While Montgomery continues his meticulous preparations for his own crossing 2 weeks later, the Americans pour across the Remagen bridgehead. To the south, General Patton, unwilling to be outdone by the First Army, launches a surprise crossing of his own at Oppenheim on March 22. He does it without an airborne drop or a massive bombardment, simply slipping the 5th Infantry Division across in assault boats under the cover of darkness. By the time Montgomery launches his grand Operation Plunder on March 23, the Rhine barrier has already been breached in multiple places. The German defense, forced to react to crises everywhere at once, disintegrates. With the Rhine crossed, the final act of the war in Europe begins. The industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr Valley, lies open. Here, the broad front strategy achieves its masterpiece of operational art. Eisenhower directs the U.S. First Army, breaking out from Remagen to swing north. Simultaneously, the U.S. 9th Army, having crossed the Rhine in the north, swings south. It is a gigantic double envelopment, a maneuver of annihilation on a scale that dwarfs the battles of antiquity. On April 1, 1945, near the town of Lippstadt, the two American armies link up. Inside the steel ring is German Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, the Wehrmacht's specialist in defensive warfare. But there is no defense against a force that surrounds you on all sides. Over 317,000 German soldiers are trapped in the Ruhr pocket. It is a larger haul of prisoners than the Russians took at Stalingrad. The industrial engines of the German war machine, the coal mines, the steel mills, the synthetic oil plants, are silenced forever. Model, realizing the total collapse of his command, commits suicide in a forest clearing rather than surrender. With the Ruhr encircled and the German army in the west effectively destroyed, the road to Berlin seems open. The U.S. Ninth Army is racing eastward, covering 50 miles a day against crumbling resistance. By April 11, their lead elements reach the Elbe River near Magdeburg. They are 50 miles from the German capital. The prize that Montgomery had argued for in September, the dream of the single thrust, is now within the grasp of the Americans. But in the map room at SHAEF, Eisenhower makes his most controversial decision of the final campaign. He looks at the intelligence reports. The Red Army is massing millions of men and thousands of tanks on the Oder River, just 30 miles from Berlin. The zoning agreements made by the Allied political leaders at the Yalta Conference have already designated Berlin as being deep inside the future Soviet occupation zone. Even if the Americans take the city, they will eventually have to hand it over to the Russians. Furthermore, intelligence suggests that the Nazi hierarchy is planning a final, fanatical stand in the National Redoubt, a mythical fortress system in the Bavarian Alps. Eisenhower fears that if the German government escapes to the mountains, the war could drag on for months of bloody guerrilla combat. On April 15, Eisenhower sends a message to General Simpson, commander of the Ninth Army. The order is simple and crushing to the men who can see the smoke of Berlin on the horizon: halt on the Elbe. The Ninth Army is to hold its position. The main effort will shift south, towards Bavaria and Austria, to cut off the retreat to the National Redoubt and link up with the Russians in the Danube Valley. The decision ignites a firestorm of criticism. The British are furious, believing that ceding the capital to Stalin will cast a long, dark shadow over the future of Europe. Yet Eisenhower stands firm, refusing to spend American lives on a prestige objective that has already been bargained away. The dream of the single thrust is finally extinguished, leaving the ruins of Berlin to the Red Army. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.